Hi, and welcome back to Digital Defense, the weekly cybersecurity show, broadcasting live from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. Bureau. My name is Jordan Robertson. I cover cybersecurity for Bloomberg. And this week I want to talk to you about the WannaCry ransomware that was kind of a big global problem this past weekend. But specifically, I want to talk to you about what you can do if you or somebody you know is infected, and how hackers are trying to monetize this information, and what you should do or shouldn't do in regard to paying them. So as always, this is an interactive show. So if you want to tweet us your questions, we're at Technology. That's Bloomberg Technology's Twitter handle, or you can leave comments in the comment section below, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So again, we're going to talk about the WannaCry ransomware today. As many viewers will know, over the weekend, this was kind of a big global, kind of cyber epidemic. We had 300,000 or more computers that were infected, most notably hospitals in the UK. A number of them were forced to turn away patients in some cases because of because their computer systems were crippled. And I want to give you an overview of what this ransomware is, what ransomware is in general, and specifically, this is going to be a problem that we're going to see a lot more of. Hacking is moving in this direction. It's moving away from data theft in many cases and toward this ransom model. So this is going to be a pretty relevant topic for a lot of us. So I want to give you some pointers on what you should and shouldn't do, whether you're infected by this particular flavor of ransomware, or you get infected at some point in the future. So a bit of background again: more than 300,000 computers were infected. Over the weekend, the infections appear to have slowed, if not stopped, and the reason for that is, and I've got a screen here for you. This is what your screen looks like if you've been infected by it. It's this kind of bright red screen that says, "What happened to my computer? Your important files are encrypted." But then it says, "Don't worry, you've got 3 days to pay us the equivalent of $300 in Bitcoin. If you don't pay in 7 days, your files will be deleted forever." And it kind of gives you a Bitcoin wallet address where you can send the payment. And so again, computer users across Europe, started to see this on Friday morning, and it spread throughout the weekend. The reason the infections have stopped spreading, for the most part, is with attacks like this, the attackers only get one shot. I mean, there's the element of surprise that once they lose it, they have basically the entire cybersecurity community looking at them. It doesn't mean they won't still try to attack. In fact, they are. The attackers are have released multiple variants of this ransomware. But what's happened is, all of these security companies and researchers have their antenna tuned to any of these infections, and they're pretty quickly able to disable a lot of those infections. But these attackers, have a really valuable capacity to infect computers, and they're not going to give that up very easily. And that capacity, in fact, was purportedly, a tool used by the National Security Agency of the U.S. government, and which was leaked a little more than 2 months ago. So what I want to talk about today is, what do you do if you're hit by one of these things, whether it's this ransomware or others? As I say, on this prompt here, they're telling you, we'll unlock your files if you send $300 worth of Bitcoin to this address, and they give you a Bitcoin wallet address. And so far, people have sent about $70,000 to that address. Now, clearly, that's not the entire universe of victims here, but enough people have felt compelled to send in payment in hopes that they would get their data back. And as far as we can tell, nobody's gotten their data back. This malware, in fact, didn't have an easy mechanism for decrypting the data. And the irony of that is, in fact, a lot of ransomware does have an easy mechanism for decrypting your data. So, we've talked to law enforcement, experts who have told us, in many cases, investigators will encourage victims, especially companies, to just pay the ransom. The odds that they get their data back are actually pretty high. As kind of laughable as it sounds, this is a business for a lot of these hackers. Many of them Eastern European. There's a big market for this out of Russia and Eastern Europe. But this is a business for them, and they have, what you would consider a reputation amongst the other services that connect into these companies, malware writers, operators of bots for sending, these attack emails and such. So they have to keep up what you would consider a good reputation. So they have to offer a reliable service. And again, it sounds preposterous to even say it, but in many cases, the ransomware operators will decrypt your data if you pay. But I'm not encouraging you to do that, because in this case, again, most people, if not all people, have not gotten their data recovered. There's just no easy way for the attackers to do that without exposing themselves. So it raises a couple of questions. Was this attack about ransom, or was this attack about causing disruption on the internet? In terms of the latter hypothesis, there's some evidence pointing to the idea that perhaps North Korean hackers could have been behind this attack. And if that's true, many of you may know that North Korea has been engaged in a series of rocket launches, very provocative rocket launches, and this idea that launching missiles that could hit the United States or hit elsewhere in Asia, and in violation of all kinds of international norms, would be accompanied by an internet crippling cyber attack. Is not outside the realm of possibility. So, we certainly need to consider that as still being, perhaps one element of the attack strategy. But so what do you do, if you are a victim from this WannaCry ransomware or a future ransomware attack? Again, I'd say there are two potential paths you can follow. And again, I want to encourage you, if you're watching this, on Facebook or YouTube or Periscope, please feel free to leave your questions underneath the video here in the comments section. We'll get to as many of those as possible, and you can tweet to us at Technology, which is Bloomberg Technology's Twitter handle. We can answer questions there as well. So again, if you've been infected by this or other ransomware, the first question you got to ask is, what's the value of the data? And is the data available anywhere else? It's kind of counterintuitive, but right now, if you back up your data to any of these cloud services, whether your phone through Verizon or AT&T or Apple through iCloud or whatever, I think historically there's been some resistance to that, because what you're doing is you're entrusting a third party with your sensitive information, whether it's family photos or sensitive documents and things like that. But in general, cloud security has gotten pretty good. The idea that Google or Amazon or Apple can protect your data better than you can, in some cases, is absolutely true, because they have lots of very highly paid engineers looking at this stuff. It also makes them a single point of attack. So if an attacker were lucky enough to get inside one of those systems, there's always that risk. But in general, I encourage people to use those cloud backups. So long as you have a good password, you have two-factor authentication, you have all the normal security precautions that I encourage people to take. That's step one. Back up your data and use the cloud services, because they're very easy. They're easier than connecting a hard drive to your computer. I have a couple other tips as well, but we're getting some questions, so I want to get to those. So thank you for those of you who are sending them in, and happy to take as many of them as we can get through. So first question here is, who is behind the ransomware attack? As I mentioned, there are some clues pointing to North Korean hackers, but the clues are pretty thin at this point. There are snippets of code in a very early version of this ransomware that was removed from subsequent versions, and that code was only linked in the past to a group called the Lazarus Group, which is believed to be a group of North Korean hackers behind the Sony hack of 2014, the Bangladesh Central Bank cyber attack, where they stole like an $80 million, it got an $80 million payment, and others as well. However, I do want to mention that evidence is pretty thin, and the reuse of code throughout hacking circles is so common as to render that link potentially meaningless without further data. So I would say North Korea, maybe. Next question here, how many people were affected by the attack? Well, we know for sure that more than 300,000 computers were actually infected, but many, many millions more were attempted. There were attempted attacks on those computers. But there's an interesting side note to this. I've gotten a number of questions about why the U.S. wasn't hit by this, or wasn't hit nearly as hard as the UK. And the reason was simply just dumb luck and just geography. What happened was, the attack started rolling out across Europe on Friday morning. And, by the time the attack just wasn't targeting a geography. The attack was targeting computers that were online. And this thing is a worm. This malware is a worm, so it spreads automatically. And it looks for computers that have this vulnerability, and most importantly, are online. It can communicate with. And as luck would have it, most folks in the US were asleep then. So their computers were just simply not turned on. So at the peak of this malware spread, the malware was pinging out all around the internet, and computers that were just not online, either PCs that were turned off or servers that were idled, things like that, they wouldn't get infected. So it was kind of just dumb luck that the U.S. And Asian countries especially as well just weren't hit by it. It was just a kind of a stroke of luck and timing and geography. Next question here is, did we ever figure out who's responsible for the Google Doc hack? Some viewers will remember the Google Doc hack was a massive phishing campaign from a few weeks ago, and it was a very convincing phishing campaign. It was, it was kind of similar to this malware attack, in which, the attackers would gain access, would trick people into giving them access to their Gmail accounts, and this email would self-replicate to all of these people's contacts. And and then you would click the email. It would come from somebody because they're in your contact list. You'd click the link, and then it would spread to all your friends. No, as far as I know, no researchers have definitively concluded who was behind that attack. But a really interesting part of that attack was it didn't seem to do anything except spread. Now, it did give the attackers access to your email accounts, so it could be used for all kinds of things. But as far as I know, the attackers weren't really monetizing that information yet. They were just spreading. So it was really unclear what the motivation was. And it stands to reason the motivation was not just to be a nuisance. A capability like that, having access to potentially millions of people's Gmail's account, you're not just going to let that go. That's not just a prank. There was probably some sort of economic model behind it, but it just hadn't been enacted yet. Next question here is, you said North Korea could be behind the ransomware attack. How is it that such an impoverished nation has developed such cutting-edge cyber capabilities? Very good question, one I've asked myself, and the answer is through partnerships, Russia and China. I mean, that's really the simplest way to answer that question. North Korea, of course, is the subject of really severe international sanctions. There's a whole lot that country can't do. However, what it can do is partner very closely with partner countries on things that both countries deem of national importance, and one of those areas is cyber. So one of the interesting things about the way that North Korea has built a cyber army, despite the fact that most people in North Korea don't have internet access, they do. The government has access to the internet, obviously very closely monitored by the U.S. government. But what it does is it sends hackers abroad. So there are, kind of training schools and cyber academies in Russia and in China, and elsewhere throughout Southeast Asia, where North Korea sends its hackers. And those hackers, it's very hard to hack out of North Korea proper. Again, there are very few internet connections in and out. And those are heavily monitored, and there's extraordinary intelligence and value there for the U.S. government and others. Just because so few people have access. So it's going to be government communications that has a lot of value. Where it gets tricky is these hackers are trained in Russia and China and elsewhere, and they stay there, and they set up kind of these satellite offices, sometimes inside legitimate software companies. So these hackers kind of lead these double lives, but they operate from places like Thailand or China or Russia, and it just makes stopping those attacks so much harder because they're not coming from necessarily known infrastructure. But we need to remember as well is that North Korea does have some strong trading partnerships, especially with China, but it also has a relationship with Russia. So it has ways of training people, in this capability. But it's a very good question because North Korea is actually up there, among the biggest cyber threats to the United States, and you'd be forgiven for scratching your head and saying, how on earth could that happen? But that's how that happens. Next question here. There seems to be an increase in cyber attacks lately. Is this at all Trump related? We're not seeing any direct links to to some of these attacks. To the Trump administration. I mean, there was obviously the election hack, of 2016, and that was pretty clearly Russian, directed and orchestrated. But in terms of some of these other cyber attacks, I'm sure there's always going to be an increase whenever there's a transition and people are filling government roles, and there is some disruption. Whenever administration hands off. But I wouldn't say that's necessarily unique to the Trump administration. However, anytime there is that disruption, that does create the potential and the possibility for exploitation. But when it comes to these types of attacks, these are kind of garden variety, internet attacks, with the one caveat that this ransomware attack, if it's proven that it was related to North Korea, that was pretty effective at getting the world's attention, for a short period of time, and causing disruption and sowing chaos, especially as North Korea is testing missiles that, by international standards, it shouldn't be. Question here is, did people who were affected by the ransomware actually pay? Yeah, in fact, people paid a total of over $70,000 to the attackers. Now, some of those are cybersecurity researchers trying to track the attackers, but many of those are ordinary people and businesses who decided it was worth the risk to give these attackers the $300 in Bitcoin in the hopes that they would decrypt the information. And you can, it's understandable. One of the themes of this show is, I want to make cybersecurity and good practices, accessible. And one of the methods to that, one of the baselines for that, is you have to understand that people who have been affected by this, if you see this screen, on your computer, and you haven't backed up your data, again, I encourage people to use cloud systems to back up your important data. Just put security on those systems, and that's a great first step. It's a desperate situation. I've talked to business owners who've had their systems compromised in this way, small business owners, medical practices and such, and the desperation they describe is profound. So yeah, people have paid. However, we haven't had any evidence that they've gotten their data back. So my advice is, if you're hit by something like this, there's a possibility you'll get your data back. But my advice would be to not pay unless your business and law enforcement recommends you to. But one of the big takeaways I wanted to give viewers for this show as well is that one of the things that happens when these ransomware attacks occur is that the cybersecurity community has actually gotten pretty good at trying to decrypt these programs. So as of today, there are a couple of programs out there, for decrypting some of these locked computers. You have to have a little bit of technical know-how. You've got to know kind of where on Twitter to find the links, and then you got to know where, how to find this information. But it's not impossible to get your data back through other means. So in some cases, sending a few $100 to an account that may or may not, unlock your data may be worth it to you. There's a possibility it may not be effective. However, it's also worth noting that in big league attacks like this, again, there are passwords out there now that will unlock some of these machines, and there are tools that will help you unlock your machines by basically, finding the private key, the unlock key in your computer's memory. It's hidden, but if you know how to look for it, there are ways to find it. So I wouldn't give up hope if this is something that has hit you. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today. Again, if you have more questions, feel free to contact us offline, either at Technology, or my Twitter handle is at JordanR1000, JORDAN, the letter R1000. And please do visit us at Bloomberg.com/technology. We've got a great podcast called Decrypted, and my colleague Mark Gurman has a great web series as well on called Gadgets with Gurman. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next week. We're broadcasting live, typically at noon Eastern here from Washington, D.C. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.